One of the crazier things you learn when you start to study ancient history is that entire chronological sequences, entire bases for understanding the core of a culture comes from ancient texts that have no vowels in any of the writings. To make matters even more weird and more interesting, these texts that not only do not have vowels, they also do not have any spaces between the words. No punctuation, nothing that would delineate the separation of words. Now, this is a problem. How the hell do you expect to read a document that is thousands of years old, that has no vowels, no spacing, or anything that differentiates any of the words? Like, how the hell do you gain any real information out of this? This is a serious question, and it's a legitimate problem, and it's one that mainstream historians don't acknowledge in the slightest. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Mainstream historians essentially believe that it's not a problem at all, that it's all figured out and that it makes perfect sense and blah, all that crap, like all the garbage the mainstream people talk about. This is a problem with history. We cannot look at a document that's thousands or supposedly thousands of years old and attempt to read it as is and expect to get all of the information that it is trying to convey correctly. The reality is there is no reason to assume that the current translations of these documents are correct. And it's a simple reason why. If you have a document with no vowels and you are not part of the time period in which it was written, how the hell do you even know you are translating this correctly? It's mind-boggling that anybody thinks that this is acceptable. This is why I want to talk about this very serious problem, because it has infested all of history. I mean, everywhere you look, you find, mainstream spouting out what they consider factual information based on documents that were written with no vowels and no spaces. Right? This is literally where the mainstream sits. Even worse is that we have entire religions based on some of these documents as well. So bringing up the religion aspect, so for example, all of the Semitic languages would be something like Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, etc. Anything like that. I think they even include, I don't know if is Qumri? Qumri might actually be Egyptian for sure. We know for a fact that the Egyptian writings, those have no punctuation or vowels either, generally speaking, but for sure, no vowels. Anyway, the point is that we find a lot of aspects of today's society, the society you live in right now, has been literally affected by these kinds of documents. Now, this is technically crazy. I mean, anybody, the reality is every single historian, the second they find this out, this should have been a tremendous concern when you start looking at supposed events that took place back in antiquity, early antiquity, etc., right? Because these documents talk about those time periods. So we need to acknowledge that we actually do have a real serious problem with trying to understand what was going on in the ancient past, especially if we are relying on documents such as these, all right? So we can't, does it sound intelligent to rely on a document that has no vowels and no spacing? Right? Most people would say, no, that's stupid. What do you mean your document doesn't have any vowels or spacing? Think about it like this. If you were to look at maybe a paper you have written, or hell, even just a text message you have written, and then you went into that message or that writing and you took out all the vowels and you deleted all of the spacing, how readable would your writing be? And be honest with yourself, right? What would it look like if you removed all the vowels from like a 20-page paper that you wrote? Oh, and also you have to remove all the spacing, right? You would just have this jumble of consonants that would essentially be unreadable. To make matters worse, if the writing that you've done is technical in some aspect, or it's trying to convey a very precise concept, Is it intelligent to write that out with no vowels, no spacing, and no punctuation? Would that be the intelligent way to write a technical document? No, of course not. If you were to do that, if you were to right now do something like that to one of your papers, and you gave it to a friend, and you were like, here you go, buddy, this is the best thing I've ever written, and all they see is a string of consonants, I mean, what, they're gonna start slapping you, right? They're gonna grab you, they're gonna start choking you. They're gonna be like, why'd you waste my time? And you're gonna be like, but you're not gonna be able to say anything because you'll be dead. Because your friend would have killed you because you gave him a paper with nothing but a string of consonants. It's stupid. Like, we don't do that. And obviously we don't do that. Why don't we do that? Because it's stupid, right? But when we go over and we transition over to mainstream historians, mainstream historians will quote all kinds of documents with none of these vowels present, with no punctuation present. Blah, 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 punctuation, can't even speak, right? But it's funny. You will find that when mainstream historians are quoting a document that originally did not have vowels, are you going to see that in their quote? The answer is, of course, no. What you see being quoted is the English translation, for example, of the original document that did not have the vowels, spaces, and punctuation. You are not seeing the original technical quote. What you are seeing is the translation of the quote from the old text. So, for example, I speak English, so when I read a document and somebody sources something in an English text, that source is also going to be quoted in an English translation. They are not generally going to give me the original Egyptian or the original Hebrew or whatever, right? You're not going to get all those little bird symbols and pyramid symbols or whatever in Egyptian in the quote. No, you're going to get an English translation of whatever the ancient Egyptians wrote relative to whatever the hell it is you're reading. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I know. That was not explained very well, but you get my point, right? Like, you don't, usually when you see a source used in a book, they are not quoting the actual Egyptian hieroglyphics, right? They're not doing that. They're not saying, and Ramses III said, bird, owl, two reeds, owl, bird. You know, it doesn't read like that. It says, Ramses said, I am Ramses and I run around and I slap people, end quote. That's what it's written like. You're not getting the original language. So what happens is that people get that disconnect between the reality of what was going on in the ancient culture writing this stuff and today how mainstream historians interpret those ancient writings. And unfortunately, we find ourselves in a position now, of course, to where mainstream authorities have got it all figured out. Or at least that's how they present themselves. And over the decades and the centuries of this, authoritative institution putting itself forward as like the end-all be-all of the historical zeitgeist, we find ourselves in a psychological situation to where the vast majority of the population ends up trusting this corrupt authority. That's where we're at right now. So one of the reasons why I wanted to cover this particular situation that we find in history is that I wanted to point out to everybody that this stuff that we may think we know, information that might be part of your personal pet theory may actually be 100% wrong, because the information that we are using is quoted text from a text that was written in a way that there may actually be no real way to translate it correctly. And that's just the reality of something we have to deal with. The other thing I want to go over in this show is the fact that this exists as a problem at all. How insane is that? That back in the day that we have scholars writing in a way that does not have vowels, no punctuation, and no spaces. It's extremely weird. I mean, even for back then, why even back then, if you're trying to convey information, why would you not write with consonants and spaces and punctuation? I mean, if you're writing something, you are probably trying to get a message across to people. Why would you make that message obscure or obfuscated or confusing? Like, why would you write like that? I mean, nobody writes like that today, at least not on purpose, or unless you're a schizo. Like, then you come to this channel and then you have mental breakdowns. But why would you write in such a manner that is essentially unreadable, even to the people back then? So now mainstream is ridiculous when it comes to their explanations for this situation, right? We find mainstream saying things like, oh yeah, they didn't add vowels because they didn't want to waste the paper. And they're perfectly fine with that explanation, by the way. They think there is nothing weird with that. They think, oh yeah, you just write one long string of consonants and then everybody that would read it back then would immediately figure it out. Really? Like, what are you talking about? The point of writing, or at least one of the points of writing, is to convey information without having access to the person who wrote it, right? If you write something down, there's a good chance that the person who reads it, you're not going to be talking to them one-to-one, face-to-face. Like, that's probably not happening. So that's why you write, right? You write it to get your information solid down on paper so that you can communicate with somebody else at a distance, or at a distant time even, right? That's the point. So if your writing is just weird, if your writing makes no sense, right? No punctuation, no vowels, I mean, are you really going to be able to accomplish that simple goal using this methodology? And the answer is no, right? It's ridiculous. Even back then, it's ridiculous. Because like I said, mainstream historians will say, oh yeah, everybody just wrote like that. They all knew what they were all talking about. I call BS on that 100%. That is stupid. There's no way that that was the case back then. Because the writing they would have been doing would have been for the same reason that we do it now. We are trying to convey a message that we ourselves cannot personally be there to convey. So for example, so by that I mean, if you're wondering what I mean by this, if I wrote a whole string of consonants and I personally hand you the piece of paper and I am there and you start to read it, I am there and I can physically correct you as you go through it, and I can say, no, this is what I meant. No, this is what I meant. No, that's what that really says, just in case you were messing up. So fine, I guess you could do that. It's still stupid, but you could do that. But if you receive a letter and it's just a string of consonants and you have to somehow fill in the vowels, right, you're going to make all kinds of mistakes, and to make matters worse, you have no way of correcting those mistakes because you do not have real-time access to the person who wrote it so that they can help you out. So writing like this makes no sense. It makes no scientific sense. It just makes no literary sense. It's purely stupid. So when a mainstream person starts saying that that's the excuse of why there's no vowels, you can run up there and you can just grab them, lift them over your head, and just smack them over your knee. You just break their back and be like, yeah! Right? You can do that because it's stupid to say that people wrote in consonants for this reason. Right? There's no reason for it. Ugh. All right, you understand what I am talking about. So let's get into the show. So what I want to do is I want to read a little snippet from one of Anatoly Fomenko's books where he covers this problem, and he does a good job with it, and he's got some good quotes in here and some good information. So I want to share that with all of you guys. And then as we read it, obviously we'll talk some crap, and then, then we'll shut this show down because we'll be bored by the end of it, and then, whatever. Now, the book I want to read from is one of Anatoly Fomenko's, and it's called The Issue with Chronology. And it's one of his first smaller books, but there's lots of good stuff in here. And real quick, before anybody freaks out for me using Anatoly Fomenko, Anatoly Fomenko is an amazing researcher. Him and Nozovsky, these guys have done unbelievably amazing chronological work. Hands down, absolutely crazy good. That does not mean that we have to agree with everything they talk about. Now, this section doesn't have anything to disagree with, really. This is all on the up and up, technically speaking. But I wanted to say something about it just because I think Anatoly Fomenko's work is becoming more popular nowadays, which means that it is starting to draw the crossfire from the mainstream here and there. Now, they haven't gone all out on him yet, but I could definitely see that happening in the future because the reality is a lot of his work is just absolutely astounding. And it's all based on math and science, like really good stuff, something that mainstream historians have nothing to fight against. That's the thing, right? We have empirical data being married to scientific observations and scientific methodology, and we're starting to discover what may have really happened in the past. Obviously, mainstream historians hate that. All right, let's get to the section. All right, this is section 8.1. How does one read a text written in consonants exclusively, the vocalization problem. The datings of other biblical fragments that we possess today also need attentive additional analysis. Really quick, the Bible is also one of these documents that suffers from this problem, and I don't think a lot of people, even in the religion itself, understands that the Bible has translation issues purely because of this fact, right? Anyway, let's get moving. Attempts to read most of the old manuscripts, such as the biblical and the ancient Egyptian ones, often confront historians with severe difficulties. Quote, "The first steps of our research into the primordial language of the Old Testament bring us to the fact of prominent importance, which is that written Hebrew neither had signs for vowels originally, nor any signs to replace them. The books of the Old Testament were written in nothing but consonants," unquote. The situation is typical. Ancient Slavonic texts, for example, also come as chains of consonants, often even lacking the vocalization symbols and separation of individual words from one another, just an endless stream of consonants. Ancient Egyptian texts also contain nothing but consonants. Quote, "The names of the Egyptian kings are rendered in a perfectly arbitrary manner, a la primary school textbook content. There is a plethora of significant variations that defy all attempts of classification, being a result of arbitrary interpretation that became tradition," unquote. Remember, the King's List is one of the most insane problems that we have with the historical chronology. Because right now, nowadays, mainstream historians, one of the backbones of their entire chronological makeup is the Egyptian King's List, right? They honestly believe that the Egyptian King's List is lined up perfectly, that they have been able to date every single name on that list, and then what they do is they will now cross-check other discoveries against the King List to try to see if they can match anything in the Egyptian's King List with whatever evidence they have so that they can date that evidence. It's insane. It's literally circular reasoning when you get down to it. And we won't go too crazy in depth, but that's the problem with the King's List, right? To make matters worse with the King's List, yeah, I know, but it's important to understand. So not only is the King's List written in a way that does not express any kind of organization or any real way of delineating any kind of differentiation between names. Not only that, we also find that there's no dates next to any of these either, right? No, there's no like, Ramses the 29th lived in, 2900 BC. None of that exists, right? There is no information like this. All of those datings, those are all arbitrarily attached to all of the, quote, kings, unquote, on that list, which brings us another problem. It's called the King's List, but we have no reason whatsoever to believe that every single name on that list is a king. No reason at all. For all we know, and it's probably true, that list of supposed names is really just listing probably higher up officials as well as kings, or just higher up people in society. Once again, the King's List, it has no real reason to be called the King's List. That's just mainstream making up their stuff to sound good. There's no reason to believe any of that. Okay, let's keep going. Is it possible that the scarcity of the high cost of writing materials made the ancient scribes extremely frugal, and the vowels were eliminated as a result? Quote, "It is true that if we take a Hebraic Bible or a manuscript nowadays, we shall find a skeleton of consonants filled with dots and other signs that are supposed to refer to the missing vowels. Such signs were not included in the ancient Hebraic Bible. The books had been written in consonants exclusively and filled with vowels by the readers to the best of their ability and in accordance with the apparent demands of common sense and oral tradition." So basically, the people who went on ahead to try to translate that Hebrew Bible, to try to get that up to snuff so that you could read it, they essentially were just making stuff up. It sounded, whatever sounded good to them, that's what they added. You know, whatever kind of made sense to them, that's how that Bible was created. So for you atheists who want a good talking point against, you know, biblical people, this is a good one because there is nothing to fight against here. Right? It also begs the question, why, if the Bible was really inspired by a God, why would God just give some dude a bunch of consonants, right? Well, it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense, right? You would think that the word of God, if God was real and he came down and he started giving people knowledge, that he would want it to be understandable. That he would not be like, yeah, just write it down in a series of consonants, bro. Yeah, screw him, whatever. You know, he goes off and drinks. I don't know. Would a God do that? You know, it just gets weird. Anyway, but that's what we find in history. We find that these people have these documents with no vowels, and they just fill in the gaps as they see fit. And then, of course, over the centuries, those new translations of those old texts then become the status quo, and then everybody starts quoting it, and then we come to the point to where we are today, where we have a screwed up history. All right. Now, the last sentence that we just read, you know, is it possible that the people way back in the day, they only wrote in consonants because they did not have access to tons of parchment or paper or papyri or, you know, whatever they were writing on, right? They didn't, you know, that stuff was supposedly all extremely rare. Definitely parchment would have been, simply because of how you make parchment. But, you know, writing material in general was supposed to be rare. So to save space, screw it. We'll just take out the consonants. You know, once again, that kind of defeats the point. If that is what these people were doing, if they were trying to save resources by not adding vowels, it just seems stupid. Because if you're going to waste your time writing something, the writing should be able to be understood by the people you are writing to. If you do not have vowels, you know, you run into that problem. So yeah, I get it that it was probably hard to get papyri and parchment and all of that stuff to write on, but why would you then waste it by writing a message that might be conveyed completely wrong due to no punctuation, no vowels, etc.? It doesn't make any sense, but that's one of the coping mechanisms that mainstream uses. All right, let's get back to it. Imagine how precise the kind of writing that consisted of nothing but consonants would be today, when the combination of BLD, for instance, could mean blood, bled, bold, build, bald, etc. RVR could stand for river, rover, or raver, etc. The vocalization aleatory quotient in ancient Hebraic and other languages is exceptionally high. Many consonant combinations may be vocalized in dozens of ways. Jacinius wrote that, quote, "It was easily understood how imperfect and unclear such writing method had been," unquote. Yeah, no kidding, right? I mean, the people already had a problem back in the day with this. This is not a new problem, by the way. There have been plenty of historians that noticed this issue and you know, they're just like, what are you talking about? How are you getting the translations out of all of these consonants? What is wrong with you people, right? And then, of course, they're accused of being witches, and then they're burned, and then okay, that's what. Okay, let's move on. T.F. Curtis also noted that, quote, "Even for priests, the meaning of the scriptures remained extremely doubtful and could only be understood with the aid of the tradition and its authority," unquote. Robertson Smith adds that, quote, "The scholars had no other guide but the actual text that was often ambiguous and oral tradition. They had no grammatical rules to follow. The Hebraic that they wrote in often allowed for verbal constructions that were impossible in the ancient language." Scaligerian history considers this status quo to have prevailed for many centuries. So basically, not only were people writing like this, but the problems that people had with this kind of writing compounded over hundreds of years, possibly over 1,000 years. right? This is not good history. If we're going to base history on something, it needs to be more solid than these kinds of writings. But here we go. The mainstream has no problem quoting all of this stuff. Not only the mainstream history, but mainstream religion as well. This has some, I guess that's one of the main problems, right? Because if mainstream historians ever acknowledge, hey, look, we can't trust any of these documents, that might actually put pressure on the church or the church institutions to, I don't know, I mean, that would put pressure on them to acknowledge that, yeah, maybe the Bible that we are reading right now is not correct. And we already, or not we, those people already have those problems anyways due to translation issues, just basic translation issues, right? Even if you had all the consonants and all of the vocalizations and the punctuation, etc., even if you have all of that, there are still problems with translating one language into another, right? And of course, we all know that biblical study has that problem. If you add in this consonant problem, then that means that the biblical problem, is just compounded, right? So it's like both institutions, both mainstream history and mainstream religion, have no interest in bringing up these facts, like these real problems, and for good reason. These institutions have no intention of losing the power that they currently hold. And it's that simple, right? It's not a mystery. You don't need some crazy conspiracy. You don't need aliens. You don't need Jesus. You need nothing other than human greed to prove that this stuff is going on. All right, let's keep going. It is furthermore assumed that, quote, this paucity of the Hebraic Bible was only remedied in the 7th or 8th century of our era, unquote, when the Masoretes had processed the Bible and added symbols that stood for vowels, but they had no other guides but their own intuition and very fragmentary oral tradition. And this fact is known perfectly well to every expert in the Hebraic language. And that's completely true. If you go and you look at high-level scholars, high-level Jewish scholars or Catholic scholars or whatever, any kind of high-level Hebraic scholar, you will find that these guys immediately admit to this as being a problem, and there's all kinds of information relative to this out there, right? There's all kinds of opinions, there's all kinds of different pieces of evidence that, they're trying to use to try to piece everything together, but it is acknowledged. The only problem is that nowadays most people don't realize it's acknowledged, whether you're in the religious side or the mainstream side, because the reality is both sides, or at least the vast majority of both sides of that coin, they don't really care about that level of scholarship. Right? Nowadays, most people who claim to be religious, they're really, none of them read the Bible, for example. None of these guys know not none, but most people have no clue what's in the Bible anymore. And they certainly are not trying to study it in any kind of depth. And obviously mainstream historians don't go to that level because they believe that the Bible generally has no real historic value. Now I completely disagree with that, right? One of the huge things that I think a lot of mainstream historians, or atheist historians, I should say militant atheist historians, they want nothing to do with the Bible because they believe it's all just God mumbo jumbo. But here's a counterpoint to that. I don't believe in God or anything, but to say that the Bible is not a historic document would be false. Because regardless of however much you hate it, the reality is that the Bible was written hundreds and hundreds of years ago. Maybe, anyway, that's a different subject. My point is that it's older, right? So anything written in there is an insight into the culture that was writing it. Not only that, but the stories may actually have some kind of historic value as well. And in fact, they do. But that's a different topic for a different time. My point of even bringing this up in any capacity is just to hopefully convince those of you who really hate religion, be careful on what you write off as evidence. You don't have to look at the Bible as a mystical God document. If you look at it just as an ancient document, we actually find a lot of cool, crazy stuff. And you know what? Regardless, I'll bring it more to this show, and I'll show you guys down the line. Anyway, let's keep going with the book. All right, jumping back in. Since the Masoretes and their efforts in the 7th and 8th centuries, The Jews have started to protect their holy books with the utmost zeal and vigor when it had already been too late to mitigate the damage done to them in any way. The result of this overzealous protection had been the immanentization of the distortions that had been made equal to the original text in authority. The common opinion used to be that the vowels were introduced into the Hebraic text by Ezra in the 5th century BC. When Levita and Capellus proved this wrong in the 16th and 17th century France, demonstrating that the vowels have only been introduced by the Masoretes. The discovery made a great sensation in the entire Protestant Europe. Many were of the opinion that this new theory might lead to the complete dethronement of religion. If the vowels weren't received in an epiphany of divine inspiration, being merely a human creation, and a relatively recent one at that, how could one rely on the text of the Holy Writ? The debate that followed had been amongst the most heated in history of the new biblical criticism, and had carried on for over more than a century. It has finally ended when the veracity of the new opinion was acknowledged by everyone. If such fierce disputes flared up around the biblical vocalizations in the 16th and 17th century, could this mean these very vocalizations were introduced very recently? Could this have been in the 15th and 16th century? And since this vocalization version was far from the commonly accepted version, it had to encounter opposition, which may have been quite vehement. It was only much later that the Masoret deciphering of the Bible shifted into the 7th and 8th century AD, so as to give the biblical text the authority of antiquity. So basically what he is saying there is that in the 16th and 17th centuries, basically people were calling out the garbage that was the Bible at the time. And the garbage in this case was the translation of the Bible. Basically, was the Bible really from ancient times? Because it certainly does not seem like it is, because the new vocalizations that were introduced really seem like they came from the 15th, 16th century, right? So, by the time these people were reading the Bible, these people thought the Bible was 1,000+ years old, we think. But when something like this comes to light where it's obviously not that old, this is a problem. Now, this is actually an extremely interesting part of chronology. And I don't know how much you'll go into it, but we'll do a show on this later, because it is entirely possible that the New and Old Testament were not written, back in the Greek BC time period. Nothing like that. It is entirely possible that the Bible was written in the 16th century or the 15th century, maybe the 14th. It gets crazy. Well, yeah, actually the 14th as well. Anyways, my point is that the Bible might be more of a Renaissance creation. So it gets crazy. So let's keep going here. The situation with the Quran must have been similar. We are informed that, quote, Arabic writing becomes developed further in the middle of the 7th century, when the first transcription of the Quran took place, 651 AD. The additional diacritic marks on, above, or beneath the letter were introduced in the second half of the 7th century for differentiating between similarly written letters, for vowels and doubled vowels. Other sources tell us that the vocalizations were only introduced in the second half of the 7th century by al-Khalil ibn Ahmed. Could all of this activity have taken place in the 15th and 16th century? And that's the question. because we run into a situation where we run into all kinds of problems here. But the reality is, when we are looking at all of these documents, right, these documents are supposed to be thousands of years old, right? So, for example, we've talked a little bit about the Bible here. The Bible is not supposed to have been written in the 14th century. The Bible, as far as everybody was concerned, was written in the BC, very early AD time periods. But when we start looking at the actual evidence, and people did even back in the day, even a few hundred years ago, people were already calling this stuff out. When you start to look at the actual evidence, suddenly things start to not make sense. So we run into the situation, obviously, of the vowel problem. So that sucks. And so that causes confusion. So that's enough of a problem as it is. However, when they start looking at the people who are introducing all of the vowels, what we find is that all of those vowel combinations were not introduced in, the 7th, 8th century, but instead are very reminiscent of 14th to 15th century vowel usage and vernacular as well. So people started looking at this thinking, wait a second, like, how can this possibly be that old if the vocalizations are all relatively new? Right? And now on one hand, you might say, well, I mean, they had to do what they had to do with what they had. And so obviously, however people were going to be talking, they would have been talking at, in the current period of time in the way that people would talk. But that also works against them, because that means that if they find that vowel usage and vernacular is being used in a sense that was being used 200 years earlier, but that is supposed to be the original version, that doesn't work anymore, because suddenly the original version is not thousands of years old. It is now only a couple of hundred years old. Now, obviously, that does not work in the church's favor, because that means that the church is a brand new lie. That also means the chronology from a historical perspective is a lie. And ultimately, this messes with all kinds of aspects of human life, because the reality is the mainstream historical chronology is ultimately based on the Bible. Never forget that. Remember, every time you believe that the main chronology is real, you are admitting to saying that the Bible is a legitimate document. Right now, I don't make that claim for myself, but what I'm saying is that a lot of mainstream people, especially militant atheists, they have no problem using the mainstream chronology, literally never understanding that the mainstream chronology is 100% based on the Bible. It is literally one of the backbones of history. Now, if one of the backbones of history is wrong, if it was not written, 1,000, 2,000 years ago or whatever, suddenly any chronology that is based on the dating of the Bible now has to be re-examined, because if the Bible's not that old, that means that the other chronologies also have to change. And then, of course, that is like knocking over a house of cards, like, immediately. So that's a huge problem. So this is why you do not see mainstream historians really actively going into this arena to attack the biblical section, and you don't see the biblical scholars attacking the mainstream historians, because both sides at some level or another are aware of the fragility of their position. So never forget that. All right, I'll read one more little section, because this kind of gives another good example of what we run into with respect to trying to read what people were trying to convey. Here, let's get to it. Section 8.2. The sounds R and L were often confused in the Middle Ages. We shall give some direct evidence of the fact that the sounds R and L were often subject to flexion. Amsterdam, among others, is a city whose name was affected by such instability and was called Amsterdam, Amsteldam, and Amstelladami, etc. We should mention another interesting fact here. Figure 1.34, which I'll have on the screen, shows the title page of a book on navigation published in Amsterdam in 1625. The name of the city is already given as Amsterdam, the way it is written today. However, the old engraving that one sees on the same page gives the old name in a rather peculiar spelling, Amstellerdam. Both consonants are present here, and a bizarre combination of sounds is achieved as a result. This reminds us that the names of many European towns and cities had remained unstable until fairly recently, when they became Yemenitized in the printing press epoch. Numerous other examples of this phenomenon are given below. And I'll put them up on the screen for you guys here. But that's what we find, right? Like a lot of the things that people don't really take into consideration when they're reading ancient texts or translations of ancient texts is that, just like today, how our languages are constantly shifting. I mean, good God, think about English in today's day and age. Just think about like the last 20 years or so, and you can see how many new words have been created, how many other words have been twisted, how many other words have been shortened, the different inflections that have been added to. I mean, it's insane, right? You can literally take the English language in today's day and age, go back like 200 years, and if you were to speak it in a certain way, people 200 years from now would never understand you. Like if you were to, really use some of the other kinds of types of English language that we use in today's society, it's a completely different situation. So you could still be writing in English, for example, but an English reader may not actually be able to understand what you're writing due to how the morphism of the words have evolved over time. Just something to think about, because obviously people 300 years ago were not talking and thinking exactly like we do nowadays. And the reason for that is simple. There's a 300-year gap. So things have changed, things have happened, new words have been coined, new aspects of culture have arisen, which also demanded new kinds of words. Hell, even spellings have now changed. I mean, even the way we write letters have changed. So for example, if you read texts in like the 1800s, 1600s probably as well, and you look at how they write their S, it looks like an F, but it's an S. And that's just a couple hundred years ago, right? It's amazing the little things that get altered over time. Now, of course, there's a consequence to this. When scholars of any age start to look at stuff like this, they have to decide which direction to read these words in, right? How are you going to handle all of these changes? And the reality is, in history, most scholars have not done a good job in handling these changes. And even worse, we have powerful institutions that have gone out of their way to exploit, the changes in languages and the changes in the way we speak. Like, this is absolutely one of the areas that are assaulted when it comes to trying to gain some kind of control over a situation, is that if you can obfuscate the language, if you can change the language, if you can control the language and the meaning of the language, that gives you power not only to control people in the present, but it also gives you the capability to control how the past is read. So we have to be careful with all of this stuff. So just remember all of that when you guys are looking at all of these ancient texts. Go out of your way to try to find other interpretations of the text you're reading, because there's a good chance that there's probably a better interpretation and there's a more correct interpretation out there. Now, of course, how do you know it's correct or better? Well, that's where things get crazy. But that's also where you have to be honest with yourself when you look at these things. At the end of the day, you've got to come to the conclusion that the way the mainstream chronology has been laid out for us does not match, what we find in all of these documents. It doesn't match any of it. It just doesn't work. The only way that it works is when you have a mainstream institution take that work and then, they change it to, or they make it sound like however they need to make it sound. And then, of course, people just follow them from there on. And then nobody questions this stuff, right? These people have the authority to make these changes and nobody stops them. So this is what we are up against as chronologists and historians. We have to somehow get through all of this garbage. Anyway, okay, I'm just ranting. All right, so anyway, there we go. We have to be careful when we look at old documents, because there's a good chance that the translation you're reading is not legit, or at least it could be better. Or another problem, it may not ever be possible to truly translate that work into your language for the full effect. So keep that in mind as well. And then, of course, we have to deal with what we talked about today, You know, the fact is you might be looking at a document that originally had no vowels, no punctuation, no spaces. And it was, you know, quote unquote translated by somebody back in the day so that you could read it. But that translation might be completely wrong due to the fact that the original material had no real way of conveying what it was actually trying to say. So these are real problems that we have to keep in mind. You know, it's just something nobody talks about or nobody really deals with, you know, especially when you deal with hotbed items. Nobody wants to hear that the thing that they have built their career on is completely false, right? Nobody wants to hear that. So, and they're not, so they don't listen. They don't want to. All right, you get my point. We'll cut this off early and get you guys some time to go do something else with your life, because you should, because this sucks. Okay.